All right, welcome back to History 1510. About halfway through Chapter 3, Ancient Egypt. Okay, we've spoken about the politics, the social structure, very patriarchal. By patriarchal, it means pa is in charge, right? Male dominant. And with regard to the economy, we have this similar specialization to what we saw in Mesopotamia. Okay, where complex civilizations that are long settled generate wealth. Somehow it always seems to be a minority that lays claim to that wealth. Okay? Usually the wealthy also govern. The Egyptians will trade, not only along the Nile with Nubia, but also through the Red Sea to places as far away as India, at least northwest India. Our topic in the next chapter, actually, people of Harappa, or the Indus Valley civilization. Where did they trade? Iron, pottery, linen, jewelry. These images, the image of jars, actually cosmetic jars. So Egyptians, at least the wealthy, apparently very interested in at least the construction of beauty. We often do see, right? Male pharaohs with makeup. So transportation, yes, we just said this, in Mesopotamia to the Red Sea, to East Africa, and also to Southwest Asia, so that's Mesopotamia. Writing, getting into the culture a bit. Early writing arose in the Nile Valley. Was it copied from the Sumerians in Mesopotamia? Hard to say that it was because the writing is so different. Did the idea of writing migrate from Mesopotamia, Sumer to Egypt? Hard to prove that it did, but possibly. Okay? Both societies found the need for writing. The writing is very different. The Egyptians had a hieroglyphic text. It was actually long forgotten from the age of the fall of the Roman Empire until the time of Napoleon. So we're talking about 1,200 years. The Egyptian writing had been forgotten. Napoleon's troops moving through Egypt found a rock. It's called the Rosetta Stone. There's an image of it there. Google it sometime and get a better image. That had a hieroglyphic in Old Greek, and if you could read Old Greek, which people still could, you could slowly translate the hieroglyphics. So hieroglyphics was lost for a long time, and now, well, not I, but experts can read it. Okay. One of the problems with hieroglyphics, the Egyptians did not tend to write things into big chunks of wet clay that they could bake and kind of hang around forever, hard data, like the Mesopotamians. They wrote on a type of paper. And I know we generally give the Chinese credit much later for the invention of paper, but the Egyptians had a kind of a paper. It was made out of a papyrus, a plant that grew in the Nile. You'd kind of grind it up and mash it together and dry it out. You have this kind of heavy, crinkly, I'm going to call it paper. That doesn't tend to last forever. Okay? In the Egyptian climate, papyrus might be around for a long time. But gradually, humidity, wear and tear, it's going to fall apart. Only a very few could read or write. You had to go to special schools. They were not public schools. These were private schools. You were the sons, S-O-N, of a wealthy family. You could become a scribe. And you'd get a good job, right? Just like in Mesopotamia, you could be a scribe for the temple, scribe for the rulers. You kind of had this cushy job because you had an education. Well, they figured that out a long time ago, and now we're still kind of in that modality, right? Nubia had a form of writing as well. Meritoidic, it's still not been deciphered. So, like hieroglyphics 300 years ago, it was not deciphered, no one could read it. The script of the Nubians and other scripts today, kind of a record-keeping system of the Inca, of what is now Peru, the people in the next chapter, the Harappans of the Indus Valley, their script, their writing has not yet been deciphered. How do you decipher something if you have no reference? It's tough. Over the last 50 years, actually, the Mayan of Central America script has been deciphered, but it's tough. I don't know, maybe through an application of AI technology, we can begin to decipher, and then probably the Nubians get a whole chapter in the textbook. Okay, so good for them. We have less to say about them now because we have fewer primary sources. That's sadly how history tends to work. Moving on with culture, religion became highly organized and was shaped by the agricultural cycles, right? So it's summer and we harvest in the fall, and then there's a winter. It actually gets cold in the desert, but it's not snowy winter for the Egyptians, and then spring and then summer. So there's a cyclical view, cycle view of life, right? The Nile floods, it retreats. The next year it floods, it recedes. Okay? So there's a belief in an afterlife. Mummification will be a process that's developed in Egypt, although the Inca, with zero connection to Egypt, the Inca live in the west coast, mountainous Andes region of South America, will also engage in the mummification of their rulers. So mummification, in some ways, the body became a seed that could be planted and give life again. Right? So think of the body has to be preserved as a seed where it's planted in the earth. And if you're really special, you get planted, so to speak, in a pyramid. Okay? But remember, that's only during an early period of Egyptian rule. Polytheistic, there's the cult of Amun, the cult of Ra, and then when Egypt is unified, it becomes the cult of Amun-Ra, the sun god, right? The sun, the star that keeps life on this planet. Osiris becomes a separate cult. Osiris is given the symbol, or is symbolized by the Nile. Osiris was a man who had been killed by his evil brother Seth, chopped up, and his Osiris's wife, Isis, put his body back together again, and the gods were so impressed that they returned him to life. And so he dies, comes back to life, dies, comes back to life, like the Nile, right? Floods, recedes, floods, recedes. Isis will have her own really important cult in Egypt in a later period. That's Isis, the goddess, not ISIS, the group today, the Islamist group today, obviously, no connection. Osiris will also become the judge of the dead, will weigh human hearts, as I mentioned at the outset. So if somehow your heart is lighter than a feather because it's not burdened by sin, you're in. Cool. There will actually be a time in Egyptian history when you could almost lie your way past Osiris, or at least that was the belief. That in the Book of the Dead, you could kind of pay priests to write incantations for you, prayers for you, so you could kind of sneak past Osiris and flatter Osiris with how handsome he was, and how good your life was, and how you never did a bad thing. Okay? Religion in some ways will become corrupted, right? Wealthy, it's a monopoly, become corrupted. Into this context, in the 1300s BCE, came a reforming pharaoh, Akhenaten, okay, who basically says, this is all bullshit, there's only one God, and that God doesn't have a form, doesn't have a face, doesn't have hands. That God is symbolized by the sun disk. He didn't really want to admit that, therefore, he could not be a God himself, right? But in art, he's portrayed as just a normal guy, okay? A normal guy playing with his daughters, very beautiful wife, Nefertiti. But there might have been a backlash to this. I mean, there certainly was a backlash. What happens to all you priests of Osiris and Ra, and the god of basket weaving, and the god of writing, and all these other gods whose names I didn't even commit to memory ever, though I'm trying to remember some of them. You're out of a job, right? So there's going to be a backlash among the priesthood against the pharaoh. He dies at a young age. This would be a good movie. We don't know if he was somehow killed, but he would not be represented like this two-dimensional Horus figure, like human body flat against a wall with a falcon head. No, he would not want that. Whoops. Don't click on the image. Unless you want to be taken to Wikipedia, right? Wikimedia. Look, the Egyptian people were inherently conservative. They didn't want things to change. They did not want a revolution from the top. They did not want to follow Akhenaten's kind of sort of monotheism, and Akhenaten began to persecute people who went against him. Oh, what? The monotheist is persecuting the polytheist, and that has also been a hallmark through history of monotheism, sadly. Right? Look, if I believe in one God, let me phrase it differently. If I believe in many gods, let's say we're living in Egypt, 3,400 years ago. I believe in many gods, and you can kind of come in, into Memphis or wherever we are, And you say, no, there's another God. Okay, now there's a God of papyrus making. I'm like, okay, that makes sense, right? Not a big deal. There's one more God among many. But if I say there's only one God, and then you say, no, there's actually another one, here he is, or she is, then there's a cause for conflict there. Okay? There's a cause for conflict. So traditionally, polytheistic religions have been more tolerant, okay, of other views than the monotheistic creeds. It's not always the case. Not always the case. I mean, if I look around the world today, there's a persecution of Muslim, monotheistic, Rohingya by Buddhists in Myanmar, for example. So this is not always the case, but historically it's been the general trend. Okay, we've moved on to something else. So Akhenaten dies at a fairly young age. He does have a son, a child. He has a couple daughters and a son. And when his son becomes the next pharaoh, by the way, pharaohs tended to have children with their own sisters, which doesn't work out so well for kind of genetic diversity. So it tended to be that the dynasties didn't last very long. Okay? A family of rulers will be replaced by another family of rulers within a couple of generations because of, frankly, inbreeding. I'm not sure where that leaves me with Akhenaten. I have no examples of that. But Akhenaten's son, Tukhenaten, changes his name from the worship of Aten, the sun disk, back to Amun-Ra. So Tukhenaten, his son, becomes Tutankhamun, who becomes really famous, probably in his own era, but certainly in the 1920s when his tomb is discovered unmolested. Pretty much his tomb was intact, and it's a great archaeological find, and it's the big thing in the 1920s. So 100 years ago, King Tut's tomb was discovered. Okay, more than 100 years ago, we have a Bantu expansion. I do just want to check my timer, so I'm not speaking to a dead camera. Okay, this will be fine. Bantu expansion. So we have a language family on the move. Okay, this is far from Egypt. Egypt is up here. The Bantu homeland, you don't see a definite geographic boundary because map makers are just guessing, right? We're, again, talking about a language tree. Well, the roots of that tree are here. It's going to branch eastward and southward. Can't go northward because the Sahara Desert is expanding, right? So if we're living in a village here, 100 people, maybe 200 people, and it's just getting too crowded. There's not enough farmland. One way to deal with the population pressure is my mom, my dad, my wife and I, or my husband and I, whatever, are going to move. We take to our canoes, we take our cows, we take our iron-making technology, our language, and move, right? Eastward and southward. Now the Bantus, 5,000 years ago, did not have writing. Okay, so their migrations have been traced by linguists, branch of anthropology, and most of the languages below my shadow here, below the desert, even today, or certainly before 1800, most of them were of Bantu origin. So similarly to most of the languages of Europe, Indo-European origin, most of the languages of sub-Saharan Africa, at least 200 years ago, before European imperialism brought English and German and French and Portuguese and Dutch, okay, were Bantu origin. Okay. So what happens? Similarly to the Europeans, I'm going to move with my cows and my horse and iron-making technology to here. I marry someone, and then our children move to here, and their children move to here, their children. All the time, it's not an armed invasion, okay? It's people wandering who look for more farmland, more grazing for their cattle, new opportunities. So sporadic migrations. They trade with the people they'd encountered. They sleep with the people they encountered, okay? So there's going to be mixed culture. And today, hundreds of languages. Well, again, at least 200 years ago before the real European onslaught into Africa, into sub-Saharan Africa. I know you could argue that begins in the 1450s with the Portuguese, but really the conquest of Africa by Europeans is post-1880. That's when all these European languages are introduced. But before that time, hundreds of African languages, most of which had Bantu roots. Okay, so again, upside down tree. So, these are agricultural societies raising cattle, raising grain crops, settled societies. But again, I mean, one solution to the growing population and complexity is to start to build cities and build walls and build great armies and start writing. Another is like, well, it's a little crowded here, we're going to move. Okay? That's not a less sophisticated solution. I kind of see that right now, in fact, during the whole, in case anyone finds us a long time from now, we're in the midst of a COVID pandemic, right? And people are actually leaving cities. People are leaving big cities. Well, they can work remotely, they can kind of work anywhere, and going into small towns and even rural areas and buying up homes. Okay, so I'm kind of broadcasting here from Chautauqua County. Home prices are going up. Why? Well, one reason is because people are moving into this more rural, small town environment to get the heck out of big cities because of this pandemic. And will they go back when the pandemic's over? Who knows, right? Who knows? Maybe they will like small town life as long as they can make a high income by working remotely. Who knows, right? So, it's not less sophisticated to move instead of build a civilization. How do they live? Well, villages of about 100 people. Order is kept in an age grade system. So it's kind of like all of you who were born at the same time are in an age grade. You go through initiation rites of puberty at the same time. You're kind of like the class of 2020. You have these same experiences, and there's peer pressure. Like, don't let anyone from our group kill someone else. There's peer pressure, like don't steal, don't cheat, don't lie. There's pressure within members of your same cohort, same age grade. Of course, the elders are in charge. They set the rules. Society's, in some ways simple, but that's not to be denigrated. It's not a bad thing where you have 100 or 200 people where everybody knows each other. And when you get a little bit bigger, as a society, people move elsewhere and start a new village. I kind of like that right now, actually. Right? Each age grade has its own responsibilities. Okay, so yes, teenagers apparently were supposed to stay up late and watch the village. Okay, so they built the same way. We do believe that most of these societies were monotheistic, believed in one God, a God, kind of a deist, kind of a deism, where there's a God who created a perfect universe, gave us a code of morality, and that's it, right? It doesn't have to be written. Someone in the village can explain what Nyamba, this great God spirit, the creator, expects. But Nyamba doesn't necessarily have a personality, right? There's a perfect nature, and there's balance, and we have morality, and we need to act properly. You don't need a big, heavy book to say that, right? This is a much oral tradition. But it's also, in some ways, to some people, kind of uncomfortable. Like, but I want God to look like me. I want God to have a face and understanding and help me on my first history exam, right? Not to be too facetious. So often religions create an intermediary. If God is this big, powerful force, how can God know little old me? Well, my grandmother knew me, and my grandmother's passed on, and she's between myself and the Great Spirit. My grandmother can help me. My grandmother can pray for me. So this is not to be taken lightly, actually. This kind of ancestral worship became a fundamental part of these early African religions, right? That the dead should be respected. In modern Western society, there's often respect for people who have passed on, but in a different way, right? You might have a photo of someone you loved and who died, somewhere in your home, right? So we kind of do it in a different way. In this case, they might have literally, although there might not have been a lot of food, but they would have put out a bowl of porridge for the deceased spirit of one's grandmother. Because that meant a little bit of sacrifice for oneself through honoring a deceased person. So, there was a lot of diversity among the peoples of Africa. It's tough to encapsulate it all in one chapter or in a couple of lectures. But great diversity, both in language, culture, economic, society, but sophisticated cultures nonetheless. Okay? Again, not to be denigrated, not to take a late 19th century European view that somehow this was inferior because there weren't huge cities, there weren't, certainly in Egypt there were, right? But below this era there weren't cities or writing. These were really sophisticated, in some ways really beautiful societies. Okay. So we'll leave it at that, and next time, well, I'm actually going to put out a video. You're going to hear from